They said the house grew before the man returned. Not taller, not wider, just fuller, as if the air inside had learned to remember him. In the hills above Santander, where the river wound through thick fog and slow mornings, a house stood alone on a ridge. Its walls were pale stucco, the roof red clay, the windows narrow and uneven. Locals called it La Casa en Espera, the waiting house, because it had remained untouched since 1882. Its owner, Don Aurelio Suarez, had built it by hand, 1 brick per week, and then vanished before he could live inside it. Some said he left for Bogota to buy supplies and never returned. Others swore they saw him months later, walking alone downriver, clothes soaked, eyes open as if sleepwalking. No one was certain when the house began to change. By the turn of the century, farmers noticed that its color no longer matched the soil. Each year the plaster grew darker, the wood richer, as if time inside it moved slower than outside. The vines along its southern wall never withered. They curled neatly around the windows, always green, even during drought. When fog rolled through the valley, it thinned near the house, splitting gently around it like water around stone. Children were warned not to go near. They said if you stood too close to the front door, you could hear footsteps pacing on the upper floor. Always one step, then another, then stillness. The kind of rhythm that sounded human but not alive. In 1902, the property passed into the hands of the provincial office. A young surveyor named Tomas Rivera was assigned to inspect it before resale. He was 26, meticulous, and newly married. His superiors told him the journey would take a day. He packed measuring tools, a small notebook, and a lunch wrapped in brown paper. When he arrived that afternoon, the valley had already begun to gray. The house stood at the edge of the ridge, perfectly intact despite decades of neglect. Not a single tile out of place. The lock on the front door gleamed faintly, unworn. The brass still held its polish. Tomas hesitated before entering. The key, left for him at the local parish, fit perfectly. When the door opened, air that had not moved in 20 years slid out, cool and clean, smelling faintly of rain. Inside, everything waited, furniture covered in white sheets, walls smooth and free of dust. A clock on the mantel, unwound but spotless. In the kitchen, a glass sat beside a pitcher of water that had long since evaporated, leaving a ring like a breath mark. He wrote in his notebook, "House appears maintained, though no caretaker assigned." Then he paused. The second floor creaked. Once, sharply, then nothing. He called out. No answer. The staircase curved tightly upward. At the top, 4 doors stood in a perfect line, all closed. The first opened into a bedroom. The bed was made, sheets tucked tight, pillows fluffed. A faint smell of wood oil lingered. The second room was empty except for a chair facing the window. On the windowsill, a fine layer of dust had formed around a single clear patch, the size of a human hand. He touched it. The wood was warm. He opened the last door slowly. Inside was an office, bare desk, a single ledger, a quill without ink. The window there faced the same ridge he'd climbed earlier. He could see his footprints in the soil below, still fresh, leading up the path. Then, as he turned away, he noticed something. Another set of footprints, next to his, identical in size and direction, leading all the way to the door. He stood frozen. The air in the room thickened slightly, not colder, just heavier. A soft sound came from somewhere above him, a quiet settling, like furniture adjusting after someone stands. When he stepped into the hallway again, the clock downstairs had started ticking. He waited, listening. Each tick sounded slightly slower than the last, until the rhythm no longer matched time at all. He left before sunset, locking the door carefully behind him. The key turned smoothly, like it had been oiled that morning. Back in the village, he told the clerk that the house was stable and could be listed for sale. But that night, unable to sleep, he took the notebook from his coat and wrote one final line beneath his report. "The house is not empty. It is waiting." Tomas returned 3 days later. He told himself it was to verify the structure again, to take more accurate measurements for the report. But he knew that wasn't the real reason. He had dreamt of the house every night since leaving it, not of its rooms or the ridge, but of the sound of that clock, still ticking in his chest long after it had stopped in his ears. The second visit began under a low ceiling of clouds. The road twisted upward, lined with wet stones that clung to his boots. The mist was heavier this time, and though the valley below was hidden, he could feel the slope widening, as if the mountain itself were leaning away. When he reached the house, it looked exactly as before. Perfect, still, aware. He tried to convince himself that what he felt was anticipation, not fear. The lock accepted the same key. The door opened without sound. Inside, the air felt warmer, as though the house had been sealed around a living thing. The smell had changed too. Faint oil, candle wax, and something else, like rain striking copper. He took notes as he moved from room to room. West wall intact. No sign of water damage. All fixtures preserved, but the clock on the mantel was ticking again. He hadn't wound it. The hand showed a different hour than his pocket watch. He touched the casing. The brass was warm. Upstairs, the dust had thickened along the hallway, except for a narrow path that led directly to the door of the office. His own footprints from the first visit were gone. The path was clean, as if someone had swept behind him. He hesitated before opening the door. The room was dim. Light pressed weakly through the glass, diffused by fog. On the desk lay the ledger again. Open now, though he remembered closing it. The pages were blank, except for a single line written in precise, unfamiliar handwriting. He will return when the air remembers his name. Tomas stepped back. The ink shimmered faintly, wet despite the chill. He ran his fingers just above the words. The page felt warm, almost pulsing, like skin beneath parchment. He closed the ledger, placed it back where it had been, and stepped outside onto the balcony. The valley below was invisible under fog, but the world felt smaller, compacted, folded inward. He noticed something strange then. No sound carried from the forest. No birds, no river. Even his own breath sounded distant. When he turned to re-enter the room, he saw the door had closed on its own. The handle turned, but it wouldn't open. He pushed harder. The wood gave slightly, then stopped. From inside came a faint rhythmic creak. A chair shifting, once, then again, slow and even, like someone gently rocking. He waited for the sound to stop. It didn't. It followed him down the stairs, through the hall, and out the door. By the time he reached the ridge, night had fallen. He glanced back only once. The windows glowed faintly, the way glass glows when reflecting fire, though there was no light inside to cause it. In town, he stayed at a small inn. The clerk noticed his silence and his hands, which trembled slightly as he wrote his name in the register. That night, he didn't sleep. Near dawn, he heard a noise coming from outside his window. A slow, uneven tick, soft but deliberate. When he opened the shutters, there was nothing on the road, just fog. But on the window pane, pressed from the outside, were 2 fingerprints. When he returned home to his wife, she said his eyes looked strange, unfocused, as if they were watching something beyond the walls. He smiled without meaning to. That night, she woke to the sound of someone pacing upstairs. They had no upstairs. The next morning, Tomas returned to the provincial office and submitted his final report. He wrote clearly, without embellishment, as if he were describing the weather. The property is stable. No signs of decay. The house appears occupied, though no inhabitant present. Then, beneath his signature, a line in smaller handwriting. Recommend closure. It has learned to wait. The sale of the house never took place. The report Tomas submitted was filed under inconclusive condition and forgotten, buried among stacks of land surveys and rainfall charts. Months passed. The property was left unvisited, though in the nearby village people began to notice that the house could still be seen at night, faintly lit, even when the ridge lay under cloud. In March, the caretaker of the local parish climbed up to bless the site before the annual census. He returned pale, refusing to speak. His assistant, a boy of 14, later whispered that the priest had tried to unlock the front door and found it already open. Inside, he said, the table had been set for one. A single plate. A glass half full. Steam rose from the food. No one had seen smoke on the ridge that day. When word reached the provincial office, Tomas was sent again. He argued quietly, saying the reports were baseless, but his superiors insisted. He left the next morning without telling his wife. The road was different this time. The fog began earlier, thicker, as though the mountain were exhaling against his approach. He followed the same route, but the bends felt reversed. each familiar turn slightly out of place. By the time he reached the ridge, the light was already fading. The house stood waiting. Nothing in its structure had changed, but something in its presence had. The air around it felt denser, the colors subdued. The plaster walls seemed to breathe, faintly expanding and contracting with the rhythm of windless air. He opened the front door. Inside, the same order, the same stillness, and yet the clock now ticked in sync with his pulse. He moved through the room slowly, afraid to make noise. His boots left no prints in the dust. The sound of his own breath felt intrusive. At the kitchen table sat the same plate and glass, both spotless now, as if they'd been cleaned and replaced. Upstairs, in the second room, the chair by the window faced a new direction, toward the door. A folded jacket hung over its back. His jacket, the one he had left in his office the week before. He touched it. The fabric was dry, still warm from a body's absence. He whispered, "Who's here?" The air answered only with a low vibration, faint, steady, like the beginning of thunder trapped beneath the floorboards. The ledger on the desk lay open again. The same handwriting, but new words written beneath the first line. "He has already returned." He stepped back, but his body felt slow, as though gravity had thickened. His pulse matched the rhythm of the clock. The smell in the air was faintly sweet now. Not decay, but something like honey mixed with dust. From the hall, the floorboards creaked. A shadow passed across the doorframe, brief, human, unmistakable. He froze. "Don Aurelio?" he whispered. No voice answered, but the sound of breathing grew distinct, slow, measured, 2 steps away. He turned, and the corridor stretched longer than before, as if the space itself were delaying what he might see. A movement at the end of the hall, not walking, but swaying, like someone standing in place and breathing with the rhythm of the house. He forced himself down the stairs, his hand brushing the wall. The plaster was warm to the touch. He reached the front door, pulled, but it resisted. When it finally opened, cold air rushed in so sharply he nearly stumbled. Outside, the fog had receded. The valley below gleamed faintly under moonlight, its surface rippling as if covered by shallow water. But when he looked closer, he realized the ripples were not water. They were rooftops, dozens of identical houses, each pale, each waiting, scattered like reflections of the one behind him. He blinked, and they were gone. He walked downhill until dawn. When he reached the main road, his pocket watch had stopped at the exact hour he'd entered the house. He wound it twice. The second hand began to move, but backward. That afternoon, he arrived home and found his wife sitting by the window. She stared at him with tired eyes, her lips parted slightly. "I saw you last night," she said. "You were standing by the door." He tried to answer, but her gaze moved past him, to the corner of the room, where light pressed against the wall, faint and breathing. He turned. There was nothing there. That night, she woke again to footsteps, steady, deliberate, moving from room to room. This time, she didn't call his name. The next morning, Thomas stood by the window, looking at the distant hills. The fog on the horizon curled upward in a thin spiral, like smoke from a chimney. He smiled, quietly. Then he whispered, to no one she could see, "It remembers." The following weeks passed like sleep. Thomas went to work each morning, spoke little, ate almost nothing, and returned home long after sunset. His wife Clara tried to ask what troubled him, but he avoided her eyes. His answers were short, detached, rehearsed, the tone of a man who spoke through a wall he couldn't see. He spent evenings sitting at the dining table with his notebook open, copying lines from his old inspection reports again and again. He never looked at what he wrote. Sometimes she found him murmuring softly, as though repeating a name he was trying not to forget. Then one night, she woke to find the lamp still burning. He was gone. The door was open, the air cold. Outside, the mist had rolled down from the hills, soft as smoke. She called for him once, then again, her voice disappearing into the fog. At dawn, the neighbors helped her search the roads, the fields, the banks of the river. They found nothing. On the third day, she went to the provincial office to report him missing. The clerk checked the register and frowned. According to the ledger, Tomas Rivera had already resigned 2 weeks before. His file had been moved to the section for deceased personnel, unverified. His signature on the form was perfect. That night, Clara packed what little she owned and prepared to leave the village. But as she stepped outside, she heard something faint, the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock. It came from across the ridge. She followed it. The path to the house was narrow, carved by years of rain and hoof prints, but she knew where it led. The fog thickened with every step until even her lantern's flame seemed swallowed. She stopped when she saw the faint outline of the roof against the sky. The house was awake. Light moved inside it, not steady candlelight, but a slow, breathing glow that shifted from room to room, pulsing softly through the cracks of the shutters. Clara called her husband's name. The sound died instantly, like a stone dropped into deep water. She climbed the steps and reached the door. It was half open, as though waiting. Inside, the air was warm and familiar, like entering a memory that had been waiting to continue. On the table lay her husband's notebook. The pages fluttered faintly, though no wind stirred. She touched the cover. It was warm, the edges slightly damp with condensation. The first page contained his usual handwriting. Neat, structured, technical. Inspection complete. All fixtures preserved. Structure sound. The second page was different. The letters were uneven, almost trembling. The house knows me. The walls breathe slower when I'm near. She turned another page. Sometimes I think it wants me to stay. Sometimes I think it already has. The next was blank, then the final page, filled from top to bottom, the ink darker, pressed deep into the paper. She will come when the air remembers her name. Clara stepped back, breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the door, but it had closed. The latch clicked gently. The clock began to tick again. She called his name once more, whispering now, but her voice came back slower, softer, an echo that didn't belong to her. The sound of footsteps moved across the ceiling. Two, then another, then stillness. She stood in the center of the room, every hair on her arms rising. The air felt alive, expanding and contracting, as if the house itself were breathing through the walls. Then, faintly, she smelled him. Tobacco, soap, the scent that lingered in their bedsheets. Her vision blurred. She reached for the table to steady herself and noticed something beside the notebook. A glass of water, half full, catching the flicker of the lamp. Condensation slid down its side. Fresh, recent. She turned toward the stairs. The sound above her stopped. The clock on the mantel continued. Slower now. Tick, tick. Each one softer than the last, fading into the rhythm of her own pulse. When she reached the second floor, the air was thicker, warmer. A door stood ajar at the end of the hall. She pushed it open. Inside, the chair faced the window again. A shape sat there, faint, unmoving, shoulders slumped slightly forward. The light was too dim to see details. "Tomas," she whispered. The figure didn't move, but its outline seemed to breathe. She took a single step forward. The floor creaked once. The chair turned slowly, the air folding with the motion, until she saw her own reflection in the glass behind it, standing, motionless, where she shouldn't be. The shape in the chair was gone. Only the jacket remained, neatly folded, and beneath it, the ledger. It was open to a blank page. The pen lay across it, its tip still wet. Outside, dawn began to rise, but the light never reached the ridge. The fog held it back. In the village below, the church bell rang once, then stopped. The priest noted later that morning that it sounded slightly slower than before. When Clara failed to return from the hills, the village fell into its usual rhythm of silence. In those days, disappearances weren't investigated. They were absorbed, whispered about, turned into small warnings told to children before bed. A month later, a letter arrived at the provincial office. It was written in steady, elegant handwriting, dated March 17th, 1902, and signed Clara Rivera. The envelope bore no postage mark. Inside was a single page. The property is no longer vacant. All conditions remain unchanged. The house has been restored to its rightful order. The letter was added to the same folder as her husband's report. No one questioned it. Years passed. In 1905, a merchant from Bucaramanga purchased several abandoned plots in the region, including the ridge where La Casa en Espera stood. When his assistant arrived to survey the property, he found the house intact, freshly whitewashed, with roses growing along the front path. There was smoke rising from the chimney. He knocked 3 times. A woman's voice answered from inside. "Come back when he returns," she said. He left immediately and refused to go back. When the merchant returned months later with workers to clear the land, the roses were gone. The plaster had yellowed again. The house stood silent, its windows blank. Inside, dust covered everything, except for two chairs near the window, facing each other. One chair held a man's jacket, the other, a woman's shawl. Both looked newly worn. The ledger was still there, open, with a new line written in the same precise script as before. The house no longer waits. The merchant closed the book, placed it back on the desk, and left without finishing the inspection. By the next spring, the roof began to sag slightly. Tiles fell, grass grew between the steps. The locals said the house was dying, as if exhausted from waiting. But whenever anyone approached, the air grew heavy again, warm, filled with that faint smell of rain on copper. In 1912, a new road was cut through the valley. Workers laying stone near the ridge complained that their compasses spun aimlessly and their horses refused to climb the slope. Two of them later said they heard a clock ticking in the ground beneath their boots. They finished the road but left the ridge untouched. In 1920, a government official rediscovered the property in the archives and ordered a new inspection. A young architect named Ismael Cardenas was sent to evaluate its condition. He was known for his rational mind, a man who preferred measurements to myths. He arrived on an afternoon washed pale by drizzle. The house was smaller than he expected, narrow, unassuming, as though ashamed of its reputation. He entered through the open door and began sketching the layout in his notebook. He counted 4 rooms, all in fair condition, though the plaster bore faint impressions beneath its surface. The outlines of furniture that no longer existed, like memory embossed into stone. In the kitchen, he found the remains of a clock scattered on the floor. Its hands had melted into the brass casing, fused into a single line pointing downward. He lifted one of the broken gears and noticed a thin layer of moisture on it, warm to the touch despite the cold. In the study, the ledger still lay on the desk. It was closed, but a thin line of newer ink had seeped through the top page. He opened it carefully. On the first line, 1902, he will return when the heir remembers his name. On the second, 1902, he has already returned. On the third, the handwriting smaller, sharper, slightly different. 1902, the house no longer waits. And then, at the bottom of the page, a fourth line, written in faint, fresh ink that had not yet dried. 1920, he is home. Ismail stepped back, his breath catching. The air in the room was warmer than outside. Dust motes hung motionless. He closed the book. Then he noticed something impossible. Across the desk, opposite the chair he stood in, another chair was pulled out slightly, as though someone had just stood up. He touched its backrest. It was warm. When he turned toward the door, the air thickened again. The ticking sound returned, faint at first, then louder, matching his pulse. He walked outside and stood on the porch, breathing hard. The ridge was quiet. The valley below shimmered faintly under the evening haze, as if seen through glass. He left before dark, taking nothing with him. The next morning, his supervisor received an unsigned note on his desk, written in unfamiliar ink. Inspection complete. Property stable. Residents present. The note was placed in the same folder as the others. The ink was still wet. After Ismail's report, the ridge was officially marked as inhabited property, though no record of ownership could be verified. The office clerk who stamped the approval form later said he didn't remember signing it. He claimed the ink was already there when he looked down. By the mid-1920s, La Casa en Espera had become a quiet rumor again, a story traded among travelers crossing Santander, a landmark people gestured toward but never visited. The old merchants called it La Casa que Respira, the house that breathes. The name wasn't poetic, it was descriptive. Those who passed near the ridge swore they could hear faint inhalations carried through the fog, steady and human, though no one lived within 10 kilometers. The pattern was always the same, 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out. In 1934, a painter from Bogota named Elias Londoño arrived in the valley. He had heard of the house from a letter written by his late uncle, a priest who'd been stationed in Santander decades earlier. The letter had mentioned a place where silence teaches the walls to listen. Elias had spent years painting ruins, churches, decaying farms, what he called the patience of forgotten things. He believed the house would make his masterpiece. He reached the ridge in the early afternoon. The air smelled of earth and iron. His mule refused to climb the last slope, so he continued on foot, his boots sinking slightly into soft soil. When the roof came into view, he felt a sudden calm. The house stood exactly as described. Small, pale, symmetrical. The windows caught no light, as if they absorbed it. A faint vibration passed through the ground when he stepped closer. Not like an earthquake, but like breath expanding through wood and plaster. He unpacked his canvas, brushes, and oils. He planned to paint the house before entering. He spent the first hour sketching, noting the angles, the way fog clung to the lower half of the walls. Yet each time he glanced back at the ridge, the shadows shifted slightly. Not lengthening, but repositioning, as though the house adjusted itself for the portrait. When he compared his sketches, the windows had changed size between drawings. He laughed softly, convincing himself it was an error of perspective. By late afternoon, he began his first layer of paint. He mixed ochres and grays for the walls, soft greens for the fog. As he worked, the sound of the brush against canvas merged with another rhythm, faint, wooden, coming from inside the house. A slow tap. He paused. The tapping stopped. When he resumed painting, it started again, perfectly timed with his strokes. He turned, half expecting wind to move a shutter, but the air was perfectly still. He walked to the front door, calling out. His voice sounded smaller than he expected, as if the fog swallowed it before it reached the walls. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of wax and old wood. The furniture stood exactly where it should have been decades ago, preserved as if time had never found the place. On the mantel, the clock had no hands. Still, it ticked. He stepped into the next room and froze. A canvas stood on the far wall, blank, untouched, but stretched and primed exactly like the one he carried. In front of it, a small chair waited, positioned at the same angle he'd set his own stool outside. He walked closer, heartbeat rising. The surface of the blank canvas shimmered faintly, like wet paint drying. He lifted his hand and saw, in the faint reflection of the varnish, the image of himself, painting. The figure on the reflected canvas was not delayed. It moved with him perfectly. He stepped back quickly, knocking the chair over. The reflection stopped. When he turned to leave, the door behind him was closed. The ticking grew louder, then steadier, merging with his breath. "Is someone here?" he called. No answer. Only the sound of his own voice returning softer, one syllable behind. He opened the front door again and walked outside without looking back. But when he reached his easel, his painting was no longer blank. On the canvas stood the image of the house, exactly as he'd seen it, except the windows now showed two figures inside, a man standing, a woman seated by the window. Their faces were indistinct, blurred as though the brush had trembled at the moment of definition. He wiped the paint with a rag. The figures remained. By sunset, he packed his tools and left the ridge. He told no one what he'd seen. 2 days later, in his studio, he decided to destroy the painting. But when he unrolled the canvas, he froze. The figures were gone. The house was empty again. Only a faint outline remained on the second floor. A dark shape near the window turned slightly toward him. He stepped back, suddenly aware of a faint sound behind him. Tick. He turned. His studio clock had stopped at exactly the same moment the valley sun had set 2 days earlier. That night, he hung the painting in the corner of his workshop and covered it with a cloth. He tried to sleep, but woke to the sound of a door opening somewhere inside the building. When he checked, nothing had moved, except the cloth, which now lay on the floor. He left the painting where it was and locked the door. By morning, a fine layer of dust covered his table, except for 2 clear handprints, one smaller than the other. Years later, when his house was sold, the new owners found the painting hanging in the same spot, uncovered. They kept it. They said sometimes, when the evening light hit the canvas, the dust in the room rose and fell in rhythm. Like breath, the painting passed quietly from one house to another. Never sold, never displayed for long. People said it darkened with time, even when kept away from smoke or sun. Each new owner swore the same thing. The longer you looked at it, the less you could tell whether the house inside the painting was truly still or breathing. By 1941, it belonged to a retired archivist named Rafael Mendoza, who lived alone in a narrow house in Bucaramanga. He collected objects from forgotten estates, letters, keys, faded photographs. The painting came to him through a dealer who offered it cheaply, saying the last owner had left it behind when he fled the country. Rafael hung it on the wall of his study. At first, he admired its precision, the texture of the plaster, the faint mist surrounding the roof. But soon, his attention fixed on the window of the upper floor. It was dark, but not empty. He began to notice variations, subtle shifts of light, shadows that didn't belong to the hour. He told himself it was imagination, the mind's need to find movement in stillness. Yet every morning, the window's shadow had changed slightly, angled differently, as though the sun within the painting had moved overnight. He wrote to a friend, a historian named Vargas, about the phenomenon. "It behaves like a barometer," he wrote. "The air in my room feels heavier when the light inside it changes." Vargas visited the next week. The two men stood in front of the painting for nearly an hour. The archivist pointed to the upper window. "Do you see the curtain move?" Vargas smiled patiently. "It's the texture of the brushwork. Nothing more." They talked for a while longer, until Vargas noticed something else. The faint outline of the second-floor window seemed different from what Rafael described. When they measured, the dimensions didn't match the frame. It was slightly wider now. Rafael laughed nervously. "I told you." When Vargas left, the archivist sat alone, notebook open, documenting every shift he could see. The angle of the roof, the shape of the shadow on the ridge, the tone of the sky. He made precise sketches, comparing each to the previous day. Within a week, the sketches formed a slow sequence, a kind of breathing. On the 8th day, he woke to find the painting faintly glistening, as if moisture had gathered beneath the varnish. He wiped the surface with a cloth, but the sheen persisted. That evening, during a power outage, he lit a candle and stared at the image again. In the reflection of the flame on the painted window, a faint light appeared. Not the candle's reflection, but something internal, deep within the paint. He leaned closer. Behind the window, two shapes stood side by side. He blinked. They were gone. He stepped back, heart pounding, and almost dropped the candle. The flame trembled, and for an instant, he thought he saw movement at the base of the house. A thin, dark line spreading downward from the front door. The next day, he moved the painting to another wall, facing away from his desk. But even turned around, he could feel it. The air behind him seemed to vibrate faintly, as though the image continued to exist through his back. At night, the smell of dust and iron filled the room. Faint, familiar, old. He began dreaming of narrow halls and warm walls, of rooms that turned toward him when he walked. He woke with the feeling that he'd left a door open somewhere he couldn't remember. 2 weeks later, Vargas returned, finding his friend pale and exhausted. Rafael insisted he take the painting. "It doesn't belong here," he said. "It's remembering too much." Vargas hesitated but agreed. He wrapped it carefully and took it home. 3 days later, Rafael's neighbor reported that his house lights remained on all night, but no one answered the door. When police entered, they found no trace of him, no signs of struggle, no luggage missing, only his open notebook on the desk. The final entry read, "I can hear the clock again. It's closer now." When Vargas unwrapped the painting, he noticed that the small dark window had changed again. The curtain was now slightly drawn aside. A pale outline stood behind the glass, tall, still, facing outward. He tried to convince himself that it had always been there. That night, the lights in his own home flickered every 10 seconds. He turned the painting to face the wall. Weeks later, he sold it quietly to a collector in Medellin. The collector hung it in a gallery storage room where no visitors went. Yet the guard who patrolled the corridor swore he sometimes heard a faint ticking coming from behind the canvas. He asked to be reassigned. By the end of the decade, no one remembered the painter's name. The gallery eventually closed, and the collection was sold at auction. The painting's record disappeared from inventory. But those who handled it said one thing remained constant. Wherever the house was displayed, the air in the room always grew a little warmer, as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe again. By the early 1950s, the painting resurfaced quietly in the possession of a private collector in Bogotá. Señor Jaime Restrepo, a lawyer known for his fascination with unsolved disappearances. His home, An old colonial building with creaking floors and tall windows was filled with relics. Photographs without names, clocks that no longer kept time, maps of places that no longer existed. He kept the painting in his study, where only he ever entered. He told guests that it was a curiosity, a piece of anonymous realism from the provinces. Yet, according to his maid, he often spent hours at night sitting before it in silence, the lights off, his face lit only by the faint gray gleam of the canvas. In June of 1953, Restrepo invited an acquaintance, Dr. Octavio Morales, to examine the piece. Morales, a psychiatrist and amateur art historian, agreed out of curiosity. When he arrived, Restrepo had already drawn the curtains, the room lit by a single lamp. He gestured toward the painting. "Tell me what you see." Morales studied it carefully. The brushwork was old, deliberate, layered. The fog around the house was rendered with exceptional realism. But something unsettled him. The perspective of the upper window seemed to shift slightly, depending on where he stood. "It's an optical illusion," he said. "The painter must have changed angles mid-work." Restrepo smiled faintly. "And the light inside?" "There's no light. Look closer." Morales stepped forward. For a moment, it was true. Only the dull matte of varnish. Then, as his eyes adjusted, a faint radiance appeared within the house's second-floor window. It wasn't reflection. It came from within the paint itself. The glow pulsed once, subtle, like the slow expansion of breath. He exhaled sharply. "How did you do that?" Restrepo didn't answer. He only whispered, "It started 2 weeks after I hung it." That night, after Morales left, he wrote a note in his journal. "The light grows with attention. The more I watch, the longer it lasts. Sometimes I think I see movement on the stairs. Sometimes I think it watches back." Over the next months, his handwriting degraded, lines breaking, letters trembling, until the entries became fragments of thought. Warm dust, footsteps above me. It waits again. On the final page, I can hear them breathing through the wall. He vanished in December. His home was found locked from the inside. The only unusual detail noted by the police was that every clock in the house had stopped at exactly 3:10 a.m. The painting was never logged as evidence. Morales, the last to see it, later claimed that Restrepo had willed it to him. He brought it home despite his wife's protests. He told himself he didn't believe in curses. At first, he kept it in his office, behind the door, face turned to the wall. But after several nights, he began to dream of the sound of wood creaking under weight. Slow, deliberate steps crossing the ceiling above him. He would wake to silence. And yet, his pulse always matched that same rhythm. 10 seconds, pause, 10 seconds again. After weeks of insomnia, he turned the painting to face outward again. The moment he did, the air in the room seemed to shift, thicker, quieter, like the calm that follows deep underwater. The paint had grown darker. The upper window no longer reflected light at all. It absorbed it. He began documenting the changes clinically as though treating a patient. Exposure leads to mild auditory hallucinations. Footsteps, ticking. Breathing feels synchronized with perceived rhythm. Heart rate steady but elevated. A month later, he stopped writing. When his wife entered the study one morning, the window curtains were drawn. The painting hung as usual, but the floor beneath it was covered in fine red dust, as if brick or plaster had dissolved from within the wall. Morales was gone. The authorities sealed the house, assuming he'd fled the city. But his wife, who refused to leave, swore she could still hear him pacing upstairs every night at the same hour. In 1957, a fire consumed most of the property. When firefighters entered, they found one wall miraculously untouched, the wall where the painting had hung. The canvas itself survived, barely singed around the edges, the image intact. Witnesses said that even as the smoke filled the room, the house within the painting remained clear, visible through the haze, the window faintly glowing as though lit from inside. The painting was recovered, stored briefly in a university archive, and then forgotten. But the archivist who catalogued it wrote a brief remark in the margin of the file. There is a layer beneath the surface paint, faint, older. When seen under infrared light, it reveals the outline of two seated figures facing each other. The note was the last entry in the archive before the collection was closed for renovation. The painting's current location remains unknown, But those who visited the archive before it closed described a peculiar sensation when standing near the sealed storage room. A faint warmth in the air, followed by a sound, slow, rhythmic, impossible to trace, like breath filtering through the cracks of the door. In 1974, the university reopened its historical archive after nearly 2 decades of restoration. The building had changed hands twice since the fire. Most of the old catalogs were lost or mislabeled. But one file survived in the climate-controlled basement, labeled simply Property Number 12, Santander, Unknown Provenance. The clerk assigned to audit the remaining inventory was Dr. Mariana Cuellar, a historian specializing in pre-Republican architecture. She was methodical, skeptical, and the kind of academic who didn't believe in mysteries, only missing paperwork. On a gray morning that September, she descended into the basement with her assistant, Diego Rojas, to verify the contents. What they found wasn't listed on any inventory, a single wooden crate nailed shut, its surface blackened by smoke but still intact. A small brass tag read, Property, Restrepo Collection, Bogotá. Recovered 1957. Mariana frowned. Restrepo, she said. Wasn't that the case with the missing lawyer? Diego shrugged. Everything from the fire came here, but the list says it was destroyed. They pried the lid open. Inside lay the painting, darker now, varnish cracked, the surface dulled by decades of dust. But even under the weak fluorescent light, the image was unmistakable. The same small house, perched on a ridge, framed by mist and faint streaks of gray. Mariana exhaled softly. Well, you survived everything, didn't you? They carried it upstairs for cataloging. Under normal light, the painting seemed inert. Under ultraviolet, faint outlines appeared, thin, circular patterns spreading outward from the house like ripples in water. Mariana adjusted the filters, documenting each frame. At one exposure level, the fog around the roof disappeared, replaced by what looked like dozens of faint shapes, human silhouettes arranged in a wide circle around the structure. Residual brushwork, she muttered, writing quickly. Early layer, unfinished. But Diego leaned closer to the glass. They're facing outward, he said. She didn't answer. When they turned off the light, the air in the room felt different, warmer, close. The hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to slow. Mariana rubbed her temple. Let's finish the record and seal it. That night, she stayed late to complete the accession log. Her office overlooked the courtyard. The air was still. At 10:11 p.m., she heard a faint sound from the storage room below. A slow, intermittent creak, like wood shifting under weight. She ignored it at first. Then it repeated. Steady, patient, rhythmic. She went downstairs, key in hand, shoes echoing softly against the concrete. The light in the storage room was off. She switched it on. The painting stood on the examination table where they had left it. But now the surface gleamed slightly, as though someone had cleaned it. The upper window reflected light from the fluorescent tubes, or so she thought. Then she realized the reflection pulsed. A faint glow, warm and alive, shimmered inside the painted house. Mariana froze. The hum of the ventilation stopped entirely. The air thickened. The glow intensified, then dimmed again in a steady rhythm. 10 seconds bright, 10 seconds dark. Her watch ticked in sync with it. She stepped closer, whispering without meaning to. Who are you? No answer came, only a low vibration through the floor. Her breath caught, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement behind the window. A shape shifting, turning slowly as though to face her. The room's light flickered once, twice, then silence. She reached forward, fingers trembling, and touched the surface. The canvas was warm, not from the lamp, but from within. She jerked her hand back. Her skin carried a faint reddish residue, like fine dust. She shut off the lights, locked the door, and went home. At 3:10 a.m., her apartment lights flickered. The clock beside her bed stopped. When she woke, she found the smell of rain and plaster lingering in the air. The next morning, Diego arrived first. The storage room door was open. Inside, the painting was gone. The crate lay empty on the floor, its tag missing. He checked the surveillance cameras. The footage showed nothing between midnight and dawn, only the slow flicker of lights every 10 seconds, perfectly timed, for 5 continuous hours. The university filed a loss report. No theft was recorded. No replacement insurance was claimed. The painting was never seen again, Weeks later, Mariana resigned and left the city. She told colleagues she was taking a position abroad. But years afterward, her sister revealed she had received a postcard, unsigned, mailed from the countryside outside Bucaramanga. It contained no message, only an image. It showed a small white house on a ridge, half hidden in fog. The photograph was old, faded, the paper brittle. But the strangest part wasn't the image itself. It was the back. Someone had pressed their thumb against it, leaving a faint print in red dust. The postmark was dated October 3rd, 1974, 3:10 a.m. There are stories that do not end. They only change their witnesses. The house on the ridge was one of them. It never cared who arrived or why. It only needed presence, breath to echo, footsteps to measure its silence against. Time, to it, was another form of waiting. By the 1980s, the Valley of Santander had been largely abandoned to erosion. Roads that once led to the ridge were reclaimed by trees, and the few who still lived nearby avoided it altogether. But when the air was dry enough and the fog thin enough, locals swore they could still see it from the distance. The faint outline of a roof, the angle of a wall catching light that no longer existed. No one climbed the hill anymore. Not after the last man who tried, a hydrologist mapping runoff routes for the regional government, failed to return. His report, found in his jeep weeks later, contained only 3 words: house still occupied. In 1991, the region suffered one of its worst droughts. Satellite images captured the valley in unprecedented detail. Among the pale ridges, analysts noticed an anomaly, a rectangular structure with unusual thermal readings. While the ground around it registered as cold rock, the building radiated warmth. The coordinates matched the old property records of La Casa en Espera. Aerial photographs taken days later showed nothing but grass and earth. The anomaly disappeared, replaced by an unbroken surface of pale soil. When the analysts reviewed the thermal images again, the shape had shifted slightly between frames. As though breathing, the case file was marked "Sensor Error" and discarded. Years passed. The country changed, the maps were redrawn, but the ridge remained a blank space. In 2004, a small construction company acquired rights to develop the surrounding valley. Workers began clearing vegetation for survey poles. The site engineer, Julio Serrano, wrote in his daily log that one morning they found the soil unusually soft, as if someone had recently turned it over from beneath. He ordered a shallow trench to test the stability. At 60 centimeters deep, the excavator struck something solid. Julio climbed down himself to inspect. Beneath the surface, the soil had hardened into compact layers of reddish plaster. He brushed at it carefully, revealing a section of stucco wall, intact, white against the earth. Embedded within the plaster were fragments of wood and glass. The corner of a window frame. He realized slowly that the structure lay exactly where the old house had stood. The site went quiet. None of the workers moved. He told them to stop digging. But before anyone could cover the hole, one of the men, curious, leaned in and shouted down. His voice echoed, not a flat echo, but a deep one, delayed by a fraction of a second, as though the earth itself had answered back. That night, the entire work camp woke to the sound of ticking, faint, metallic, coming from the trench. The sound lasted 6 hours, perfectly steady, until dawn. By morning, the trench had collapsed. The soil above it was smooth again, no sign of disturbance. Julio closed the site and left the valley. He died 3 years later of natural causes, but among his papers, his son found a note written the day after the incident. The air moved below us. Not the wind, the air itself. The coordinates of the site were lost in bureaucratic transition. The land was never built upon. In 2018, a graduate researcher digitizing colonial maps noticed a faint annotation in the margin of an 1890 survey, a handwritten mark reading simply La Espera. She cross-referenced it with satellite data, finding nothing but forest. Still, curiosity drove her to overlay the coordinates with thermal maps from the previous year. At exactly the same location, a rectangular patch of ground appeared warmer than its surroundings, by only a few degrees, but consistently. The gradient pulsed every 10 seconds. She saved the data, labeled it Unverified Atmospheric Artifact, and archived it. The file is still there, And sometimes, when the servers are quiet and the cooling systems pause, a low rhythm can be heard through the hum. Not constant, but steady. 10 seconds, then 10 more. Those who work the night shift in that data center say the sound comes from one specific rack where the oldest drives are kept. They call it the breathing server. They joke that it's haunted. But occasionally, someone stays late enough to notice something stranger. The air near that corner feels slightly warmer, like the breath of a room that has waited too long. And if you listen closely, beneath the machines, beneath the electricity and the fans, you can almost hear a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, as if a house somewhere beneath the soil were still alive, waiting, quietly, for someone to remember its name.